Hey boys and girls, Mr. Resch here for your 8.3 lesson on the political parties of the United States, the first ones. So we left off with George Washington in his farewell address and how he said several things about what not to do and how we shouldn't divide as a country. But unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. So if you see in your little booklet for 8.3, you should see the guys up here in the corner showing the different political parties. So around 1796, Americans began to divide into two political parties. This is going to be an essential piece to your test. Make sure you understand both of the first political parties very well. But essentially, we need to go back to the Constitution and understand that it never said anything about the political parties. Washington even warned our country, don't divide, don't separate at all. It'll lead to bad things, and unfortunately it would. If we look at George Washington's presidency, though, he did tend to be on one side more than the other. And if you could guess, was it with Jefferson or Hamilton, you might have guessed that it was Hamilton because it was Hamilton's policies that were mostly favored. You know, his three-step plan to reducing the debt. So there's a term we got to introduce here. It's called partisan. And partisan means to side with a political party, okay, to favor a side. So if we look at abortion again, and we look at the Republicans tend to be pro-life. That is a partisan vote. The Democrats, on the other hand, would be pro-choice, and Democrats would mostly favor those kinds of issues. Moving on, here are your first two political parties. We can see Hamilton here on the left and Jefferson here on the right. And the two political parties that began first in our country about 1796 are the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists would soon die off in history, and the Democratic Republicans would last the longest. So Hamilton would lead the Federalists, and he believed that only the wealthy and the educated should rule. So add educated here. When it came to the Constitution's interpretation, Hamilton believed in loose interpretation so he could expand the powers. We call that implied powers. And when it came to the economy, Hamilton, you know, was a banker, so he believed in banks and manufacturing and major trade. When it came to allying with other countries in Europe, Hamilton, we recall, was a British supporter. And when it came to the banks, Hamilton wanted to create the national bank, the big bank, to help pay off the debt. So that is where he's at. The last one has to do with trade. Hamilton, remember, wanted to use tariffs to tax imports to support American buying of American goods. So there's Hamilton and the Federalists. Make sure you know those 6-7 points there. On the other hand, we have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. He was the leader of that party. He said that ordinary people should rule, and he believed that the Constitution should be strictly interpreted. This means that it is not explicitly written out in the Constitution. It should be left for states and individuals to decide. So that's his standpoint, and that will affect his presidency later on. For economy, Jefferson liked agricultural-based food. When it came to allying, he was the opposite of Hamilton. He was the French. And the banks that he liked were state banks to limit the control of the federal government, the big umbrella that we have today. When it came to trade, Jefferson did not like tariffs at all. He said, let trade be free. Let's not use them whatsoever. All right. So Washington does his farewell. He says, don't divide the country. He says, don't get into other people's affairs or other countries' affairs. So we have our natural first election here. And it goes pretty well. We have two firsts. The first is that we have our first real election. People are voting, as we can see here in the map. Okay? Candidates had party affiliations or attachments, as we call them. We have Federalists with Adams. We have Thomas Jefferson with the Democratic Republicans. So that is who the Federalists nominate. John Adams. The Democratic Republicans vote for Thomas Jefferson. Remember, because these two had such different views, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, the two once friends become rivals. What does the Constitution say about elections? If we recall back to quarter 2 when we studied the executive branch, we should remember that at the earliest times in our history, the person with the most votes would become president and the second most voted person would become vice president. So the results would make this unique situation unlike we have today. Trump and Pence are both Republicans. In this election, Adams got 71 votes. He's a Federalist, remember? And Jefferson got the second most votes with 68. So we got this kind of conflicting governmental thought process in our nation's top 2 positions of power. This would be interesting. Okay, what I want you to do right now after I drop this shade is to stop the video after you hear these instructions, and I want you to watch the John Adams video, which is right below this. It should give you a better idea of what type of person he is. When you're done watching the video, make sure you answer the question at the top of the page that you get from me. Okay? So stop the video right now and then come back.